The following is a Hoop Ball presentation. Welcome to the Fantasy NBA Today podcast.
Good morning, everybody. Welcome to Fantasy NBA Today, a Hoop Ball presentation. You just heard that from the lady who will continue to remain nameless, although the Name Watch 2018 continues. I am Dan Bespris. Let me explain myself. Middle of last week, I asked you guys to name the British lady. Yes, she is a real person, and yes, she has a real name, but I don't know what it is. Our founder, our benevolent overlord here at Hoop Ball, Mr. Aaron Brewski, sought her out on Fiverr. I don't know if you guys are familiar with that website. It's a website where you can get small art projects done, whether it's voiceover or graphic design or script writing, or whatever it is. You can check it out for $5. Most of these artists make their money through smaller fees, rush jobs, longer projects, things like that. The $5 very quickly becomes $20, $30, $40, $50. And then it's just, crank out a million things at a time. I've actually considered going on there myself, but it seems like a lot of work. So anyway, the point of all that is she's a real person who did these voices, and then I didn't remember to write down her name. So I asked you guys for submissions last week, and we have a decent chunk of them. I should have done a better job of writing them all down. Some of the submissions that we've received so far, Penelope, Penny, Simone, Amelia, Donna, Captain Smith or Commander Liz, I'm guessing this is a video game reference, Constance, can't call her Connie, by the way. This is specifically noted in the tweet. Betty Hoop, which is a Sweet Betty Boop reference combined with basketball. So what I'm going to do today, if I have a few moments, and Mondays are always a particularly busy day for me, is go back through, figure out what all of these submissions were, and I'll try to put together a little poll for it. But I think you can only have 4 options on Twitter, so I may have to get creative. If I had to pick, by the way, if you guys needed me to pick one of those submissions right now, I honestly don't know where I'd go. I think I kind of like Donna. I don't know why. It's a very phone answery kind of name. Not really British, per se. But anyway, we'll continue that nonsensical discussion at another time. It's Monday. It's Fantasy NBA Today. We had a weekend in the rear view. We're at a point, by the way, during free agency now where most of this stuff is relatively uninteresting. But Jabari Parker signing with the Bulls does register. That's on the radar. Milos Teodosic going back to the Clippers, probably not on the radar, provided Avery Bradley stays healthy. Jaren Jackson Jr.'s Summer League hype is a story these days. Shabazz Napier joining the Nets is a story over the weekend. And then there were 1 or 2 names from our free agent list that I never really got to last week, and I thought about it over the weekend and thought to myself, do I really want to launch headlong into rehashing all of the teams just yet? And my answer was no. I think there's a couple more things we need to cover. And some of them are kind of a fantasy basketball 101 type stuff. So I'm guessing at least a handful of you guys are going to be annoyed at a couple of the topics that come up this week. But after going through the schedule and kind of working my way backwards from mock draft season, because we're going to be getting into that basically by early to mid-September. I want there to be a lot of time, basically like a month, where we're really focused on actual fantasy drafts and all the information we can learn from them. We did a great job of that last year. I know it helped me, actually. It helped me a lot to go through all that good stuff. But that gives us effectively 2 months from now, which last week, for whatever reason, as I was running the numbers in my head, I kept coming up with a month and a half, and I was off. I think in my head I had the beginning of September, but it's really more like the second to third week of September. So there's no reason to rush into rehashing the teams. Players are still signing. There's still some restricted free agents floating around out there like Marcus Smart, Clint Capella. It sounds like Capella is going to be back with the Rockets for some amount of money. We don't know where Marcus Smart's going to end up. It's not necessarily set in stone. So I do think we have a little bit more to cover on the free agent front. I'd like to spend some time doing some fairly basic things on this podcast over the next couple of weeks, and that's just going through how to prepare yourself for draft season, how to go through player ratings the way that we do on this show. And I like to always go back to that 2-star rating I got on iTunes where it called the show pedantic and was also briefly my Twitter handle. Yes, there are going to be times on this podcast where we get pedantic. And I don't necessarily think that's a bad thing. I know that the term itself is used in a negative sense, but we are going to parse words on this podcast. We are going to be very careful with how we describe things. It's really easy to get taken out of context. And more than anything on the pedantic side, I want to make sure everybody knows exactly where I'm coming from. I want there to be a strong foundation of knowledge when we get into the really annoyingly specific stuff on each player. And sometimes I realize that we sort of jump over that because the podcast has existed now for a year and a half. God, it's really only been that long. A little more than that, like a year and 8 months. And I just sort of, on a day-to-day basis, kind of assume that people have been listening. But that's not necessarily the case. We're in an off-season now. We're coming up on a time, probably within the next month, where there are going to be a lot of new listeners, people trying to find their source of NBA fantasy information. And so we got to make sure that everybody knows where we're starting from. That's not necessarily going to be today's show, but it's going to be stuff over the next, I'd say, about 2 weeks that'll be mixed in just on, how does a player end up at a particular rating? What are the 9-cat and 8-cat differences? What are the head-to-head and roto differences? And we're going to be doing that. I'd like to do it more so with my co-hosts, Neil and Adrian here on the pod, because I think it's good to get into a back and forth. I also see, and you believe me, I read everything that comes across Twitter. There is generally a griping among podcast listeners of slow starts to shows. So we'll try to fix that a little bit going forward. Not today. Not today. But overall, we'll try to leap into things a little bit more. And I also think that there is some value to you guys knowing a little bit more about the guy that you're listening to. I think that builds a connection. I like to know you guys. Tweet at me, at Dan Bespers, and I hope you guys like to know me a little bit. How was my weekend? Exhausting. No rest for the weary. But it doesn't matter. We're back into the week again. It was like it never ended for me, and I would call that a good thing if it was the NBA season, but it's the off season. This is when I want to get a break. Plus, baseball's now in its all-star break. I mean, this is a real downtime. Let's do a few more free agents on today's show, and maybe that'll wrap things up. I wasn't on Friday's podcast, so there may be some duplicates that pop up here and there, but I do want to make sure that my opinion gets out into the internet world on a few players, Jabari Parker included. Here's the names we're going to cover on today's podcast, and this might be the last exclusive free agent show that we do, which will give us about 2 weeks of free agency stuff. Jeremy Grant, who we touched upon very briefly a couple weeks ago when we were waiting to find out what other things Oklahoma City is going to be doing. I want to talk very briefly about Julius Randle. I want to talk about Jabari Parker, not surprisingly there. And I want to do a very quick JJ Redick spot. And then I'll spend about 90 seconds telling you all the free agents that don't hit my radar that we haven't mentioned yet. That's not necessarily the order we're going to be working in, by the way. I want to start with Jabari Parker because that news is the most recent. Jabari Parker signs with the Bulls. The Bucks reportedly pulling the qualifying offer as sort of a show of good faith. And Jabari Parker is going to Chicago for a deal around $40 million. I don't think we have the exact number yet for 2 years. Let's assume that all of this goes according to plan. I see no reason to hold out anymore. He's going home. He is from that area. And it's a lot of money. But it's only 2 years. So that, we get into these things, and this is not fantasy relevant, but we get into these fights about what contracts are worth what. When you give 5 years to a guy like Andrew Wiggins, it's pretty different than giving 2 years to a guy like Jabari Parker. If this thing doesn't pan out, they could probably move him by next season, not this coming one, the following year, when he's a expiring contract. Everybody loves expiring contracts. It's the world we live in. But if it pans out for them, then they get 2 years of a guy that looked like he was turning into a pretty prolific scorer. How soon we forget, ladies and gentlemen, how soon we forget. Before Jabari Parker suffered his second year-long injury, he played 50 games during the 2016-2017 NBA campaign and averaged 20 points, 6 rebounds, 3 assists, a steal, and 1.5 three-pointers per game on 49% from the field. He's not, by the way, a very good free throw shooter. He's a career 75%er, which will drag you down a little bit. But going back into Sherman, get the Wayback Machine ready. If we go back to that season, not this most recent one, but the previous year, before Jabari got hurt that second time, he was a top 55 guy in 9-cat formats, and I think basically the same in 8-cat, because his turnovers were sitting just under 2 per game, and that's basically league average. It was a high-volume 49% from the field. That is a significant positive. 20 points, that's a positive. 6.5 rebounds, that's actually a positive from somebody who had small forward eligibility. 3 assists, very strong number for a small forward. I mean, a decent number. That's basically league average, but you expect like 1 from your center and, 2 to 2 and whatever, power forward, small forward, then you generally get your boost from your guards. Still, getting right around what you'd need to be middle of the pack from a guy who's giving you all these other things, that's solid. The knock, certainly free throw percentage, 75% on not small volume. I think he took 4.5 per game that year. 1 steal in 34 minutes per game, that's not very good. And 0.4 blocks, also not particularly strong. So the defensive stuff for Jabari Parker is lacking and always has been. In fact, over his career, believe it or not, he averages exactly those same numbers, 0.4 blocks and 1 steal per game. The reason that I kind of like Jabari Parker is not because of his stat set, because you guys know how I feel about points. I don't give a crap about them. I find them to be incredibly easy to come across, and trying to win points usually means you're going to lose turnovers in a 9-category format. It's not always, it's not a 1-to-1 correlation, but there is some. The reason I like Jabari Parker is that he's coming off a disaster of a season. His worst year as a pro, worse than his rookie season where he played 25 games and then blew out his ACL the first time. Yes, worse than that. Because the steals were much lower, the rebounds were lower, the shooting percentage was lower. Okay, fine, the free throw percentage was better, but you catch my drift. I don't know that many people really took a flyer on Parker. I think you generally saw him picked up after a month or two of the season. People thought, you know what, I'll hold this guy for a month and then hopefully he can give me something. And he didn't really. But even forget the fact that he left a bad taste in some people's mouths that sort of rolled the dice and thought this is a high risk, high reward kind of thing. But the risk is actually sort of nullified by the fact that I just picked him up off the waiver wire. So it's a high reward, no risk. If he doesn't pan out, I kick him to the curb. Forget that for a minute. Let's just note the fact that he hasn't played a good basketball game since basically like January of 2017. And in the way we currently absorb information and news, That's like 25 years ago. I know it's a year and a half, but it plays like 25 years ago. I don't think anybody remembers how strong his game was prior to that second injury. He was blowing everybody away. Nobody expected any of that stuff, and he just came out guns blazing. High volume, making lots of buckets, rebounding, assisting. He was doing stuff. The question then becomes, how does that translate to the Chicago Bulls, and can he ever really, truly get back to that level of health after having blown out all of his legs? I'm thinking the answer is yes, because he's still only 23. 23, guys. Some of you listening are probably 23. I'm not. I'm a dozen years older than that. At 23, what I can tell you is that I don't remember ever really feeling creaky when I woke up in the morning, except for that time I threw my back out and had a spasm for a week. But other than that, I generally woke up feeling pretty good in the morning. These guys can recover. They have insane medical staffs. They have access to the most advanced treatments ever. And he's still so young. There's going to be conditioning stuff, but now he's had time to sort of get his legs underneath him, a nice full off season. The Bulls clearly believe in him. And he fills what was effectively a pretty empty spot for Chicago. And yes, I know the analytics say that Jabari Parker as a small forward in the modern NBA is a terrible idea, but that's probably where he's playing for Chicago, so screw it. I don't care if they're not going to win a bunch of ball games. My question is he going to get some shots up? It does come down a little bit to pace. And if we have to remember that his big numbers in Milwaukee came when Chris Middleton was out. But there was still a Giannis in town, so he was never the number one option. He was the number two option on that team. And he goes to Chicago to become, well, I think if we could call Zach LaVine the number one guy, Lauri Markkanen, Chris Dunn, and Jabari Parker are all vying for the number two spot. But they all do kind of different things. Jabari Parker plays a little bit closer to the rim. Markkanen tends to drift away a little bit. Chris Dunn is a guy who's seen his offensive game come along a little bit, but is not the best offensive player on that club. He's more of a creator. I think there are going to be shots for Parker. I don't think there are going to be 16 shots a game. That's way on the high side. But I also don't think he's going to be hovering in that 10 to 10.5 shots that he was seeing this year in only 24 minutes. Or if you go back to his rookie year, it was the same general idea. I think you're looking more at the 12 to 13 shots per game. And if he's making close to half of those, then you're talking about 6 to 6 and change field goals per game, plus a couple of free throws. That gets you to about 15 points. That gets you to about 15 points per game. I think he's very reasonable to expect about 5 rebounds. Maybe a little bit over that number. It's where he's been most of his career, although, again, he's been on a bad rebounding team, so there may be a little bit of a knock. I think you'll see some passing from Jabari Parker with other guys on his team that are good on the offensive end, and I think you'll see about a steal and 0.4 blocks, since that's where he's been forever. What does that mean in terms of overall rank? And this is, by the way, why I think we need to do some shows on how to come up with these types of numbers. Well, if 50 is the upper limit of where he was at during his time in Milwaukee, and a clunker of a most recent season, I mean, what do you even want to call this one? He didn't even really play this year, but if you have to, you'd call it top 150 on 12.5 points, 5 rebounds, 2 assists, under a steal. It's somewhere between 50 and 150. That's not very helpful. I think you're looking at a guy who probably sits near top 90. Mostly because it's really easy to jump from 150 to 100. It doesn't take much. It takes a bucket and a field goal percent. That's about it. You can go a long way in that territory by playing a couple extra minutes per ball game. For Parker, I think it's going to be really hard to get back inside the top 75 on a team with 3 other legitimate starting unit scoring options, as opposed to 1, maybe 2 sometimes during his time in Milwaukee. But I also don't think that 140, where he finished this year, is a good barometer of where he's going to be. He only played 24 minutes per game. He was coming off a massive surgery. And so I've got to believe that he's going to be undervalued. He doesn't have the most fantasy-friendly game. He reminds me a little bit of a TJ Warren type in terms of the numbers he's putting up. Interesting to say that Jabari Parker's actually been more durable than TJ Warren, but Warren's always missing time with nagging things, and for Parker, it's either blow out the entire body or he's on the floor. There really isn't an in-between for him. By the way, TJ Warren, 49.5% shooting, 76% free throw, 1 steal, half a block. They are almost the exact same numbers, and Warren finished, by the way, just inside the top 75 on a per-game basis. I think you see Parker better passing ability, better outside shooting than Warren, and TJ probably a little bit better in terms of defensive stats. But they are very comparable in their fantasy games. It fills a need. It fills a need on your team. If you are lacking in scoring late in your draft, if you need a small forward that can give you a decent field goal percent, some rebounds, there's an opportunity there. There's an opportunity there for Jabari Parker because I think he's going to fall. I think he'll be drafted outside the top 100 in a lot of spots. If he's getting drafted near 75, you leave him alone. But we will learn that as the day approaches. So that's your Jabari Parker rundown. The other names I wanted to mention on today's podcast, Julius Randle, because I feel like he fits the bill of another guy who often gets overrated. Julius Randle this last season, by the way, he played in all 82 games, so good for him. 16 points, 8 rebounds, 2.5 assists. On paper, that sounds like a pretty damn fine season. But his lack of anything else is astounding. High turnovers, exceedingly low defensive stats, no three-pointers, terrible free throw shooter on high volume. Field goal percent was one of the only other spaces where he was actually helping you a little bit. And I don't know that those things change. Now, to Randall's credit, there were stretches where he played really good basketball. It happened. And there were stretches where that good basketball shot him up the rankings a little bit. But listen to these numbers and tell me where you think this puts him. Okay, we're going to play a little game here. We're going to get pedantic. 20 points per game, 9 rebounds, 3.5 assists, 0.6 steals, 0.4 blocks, 56% shooting to get to that point, 74% free throws, 3 turnovers, and 0 three-pointers per game. But again, I say 29-3 in the popcorn stats. Really strong in all 3 of those for his position on the floor, and 56% at the field goal number. So one would argue that 3 of those stats really strong regardless of what position you're playing, and then the 3.3 assists, solid for a power forward. That doesn't even get him inside the top 100. Mind-boggling, right? Mind-boggling. But getting no three-pointers, bad defensive stats, high volume, bad free throw shooting, and 3+ turnovers per game weighs it down so heavily that the bad actually outweighs the good. Or it's almost a perfect balance, if you want to call that top 100. The scales are balanced for Julius Randle. This, by the way, was when he was really balling out for the Lakers. This is when he was getting 32 minutes per game. This is from February 1 to the end of the regular season. He was going nuts, right? This was a time we were like, oh, holy crap, Lakers have to retain Julius Randle. He looks like a superstar in the making. Okay, there are deficiencies there. Pretty clear ones. But no matter how well he was playing, no matter how much he was dunking, he just can't get inside the top 75 because he has these massive, massive gaping holes in his fantasy game. So I got a feeling people are going to be going buck wild for Julius Randle again. And there are formats where he can be useful. In fact, I would argue in certain head-to-head formats, he'd be great. But if you're in a roto league where he's dropping you like a boulder, tied to a boulder, thrown in the ocean, with his minimal defensive stats, his 0 3-pointers, his high-volume missed free throws, and his super high turnovers, he just doesn't end up being worth it. I mean, his best stretch this year, basically, he was still just inside the top 100. Unfortunately for Randall, he just doesn't have a fantasy-friendly game. I don't think he scores 20 points per game, by the way, with the New Orleans Pelicans. That was the high side for him. He's going to a place where Anthony Davis is going to be grabbing every damn rebound available. He's going to be vying with Niko Mirotic for minutes, so it's not like he's just going to have carte blanche. He'll probably play about 30 minutes per game. And in a perfect world, he's a top 90 guy. Perfect world. So I think he's going to be overdrafted by a lot. I just don't see it unless the defensive stats appear out of nowhere. Maybe you could see his turnovers go down a bunch without having to orchestrate, but he's turnover prone. It's not always the fact that he was initiating the offense. He coughs it up a lot. I guess I could see that number coming down, but I also see points and rebounds coming down. So Julius Randle, really loved watching you on the Lakers. I think he's made incredible strides, but from a fantasy perspective, he's going to be overdrafted. You want a power forward who can do some interesting stuff and who actually has a decent fantasy ceiling? Look at a guy like Jeremy Grant. Oklahoma City's been making all of these wacky moves this offseason to build up a crazy, crazy payroll. But who really can play power forward on that team right now? Who could truly take on that position on the basketball court? I would argue 3 guys. Carmelo Anthony, Jeremy Grant, and Patrick Patterson. Patrick Patterson actually fits the mold these days of a center more than a power forward because he's kind of lumbering, guys. He's not a little dude anymore. He's 6'9", 230. And he didn't play that much last year anyway. Most of the minutes at power forward ended up going to Carmelo Anthony last season. Could Nerlens Noel play power forward? We didn't really see that work in Philly, so I don't know why the Thunder would try it. Could Andre Robertson play power forward? I guess. I don't think they really want him to. Which basically leaves Carmelo Anthony, Jeremy Grant, and Melo for sure is going to get traded or bought out. Because it'll save him $100 million. Sorry, Melo, you ain't worth $100 million 1 year. There aren't many guys that are. And suddenly it looks like Jeremy Grant could weave his way to 25 to 28 minutes a game, which he's never really had in his career. He got 27 minutes in Philadelphia his sophomore season, 2015-2016, and he averaged 10 and 5 with 1.6 steals per game in that stretch. Here are the issues for a guy like Jeremy Grant, because, by the way, last year he finished outside the top 200 on 8.5 points, 4 rebounds, and 1 block per game. You're looking at a guy who has a fantasy ceiling that's particularly high. He doesn't shoot many three-pointers. One would assume that's something that he will continue to work on. But he's going to be a decent field goal percentage dude playing alongside superstars. They don't need him to take bad shots. He's not going to rebound much because of Russell Westbrook, which does limit his effectiveness there. He's not a great foul shooter, which limits him there, but he is a great shot blocker. You give him 20 minutes on the floor, and there are many times where he'll get you 2 to 3 blocks. So if he's getting starters run, if he's going to be playing with the good guys, there's a world where you could see him get inside the top 100, and it'll cost you way less on draft night. I'm not saying Jeremy Grant's going to be a top 50 guy. He doesn't fit that profile. He's never going to shoot enough. He doesn't shoot free throws well enough. He'll never get there. But what if this insane place where Jeremy Grant gets 26, 27 minutes a game and blocks 2 shots a game, you can move up pretty fast, swatting a couple shots a night. So he's someone I'm looking forward to trying to grab late in fantasy drafts. It's clear that they want him there long term. They gave him a 3-year deal. So he's their guy. That plays into what we want, which is him basically getting minutes. I mentioned the fact that Shabazz Napier was signed. That does upset me a little bit. I don't want to spend too much time on it. I was getting pretty excited about Joe Harris last week. I do think Napier puts kind of a damper on that. Anything that the Nets throw into their backcourt is just another reason for them to cut minutes down. I'm starting to think perhaps that Jeremy Lin moving to Atlanta might end up being the most interesting part of all of that stuff, which is a massive shame. But we'll get into all that when we talk about the full team breakdowns, which will start in a few days here on the show. J.J. Redick was another guy I wanted to mention very briefly on today's podcast. I do think his numbers stay relatively consistent year over year, so you can look for him to try to match his stuff. Rajon Rondo, I don't think is worth drafting this season. Nerlens Noel, not worth drafting. Wilson Chandler with the Sixers, I don't think you're drafting him. The fantasy game just doesn't pan out as well. Jeff Green, not drafting him with the Wizards. Nemanja Bjelica, not drafting him. Doug McDermott, no thanks. Aaron Baines, no thanks. Ed Davis, no thanks. Derrick Rose, no thanks. There's a name floating around. This will be the last one that we talk about on today's podcast. There's a name floating around that might end up being interesting. And believe it or not, it's Marco Bellinelli, who is fully familiar with how things work in San Antonio, and they just keep getting thinned out. Remember, he played with the Spurs 2013 through 2015, and it wasn't like he did anything different than what he's been doing, but he played really well in Philadelphia when they gave him 26 minutes a game, and if he can see that many minutes or more, he could be a three-point specialist. I'm not drafting him. I don't think anybody will. I think he's a guy you can snatch if you want in the very last round or just pick him up off waivers if things look good as guys continue to move out of San Antonio. Jaren Jackson Jr. blocking shots like it's going out of style. Everybody's going to be overdrafting him on draft night. I don't think you're going to want to pay that premium, but we'll certainly keep an eye on where he gets picked up. Milos Teodosic with the Clippers, a 1-year, $6.3 million deal. That just clogs up the backcourt. As I said, I don't think he's worth drafting. I do think Avery Bradley's worth drafting, believe it or not, this year. I think he's going to be an afterthought, and I think you could get him right at the very end of drafts, and he'll probably give you a top 100 kind of season. So there you go. Told you I'd give you a bit of a lightning round at the end of the podcast. Tomorrow, Adrian Benjamins, myself, will be hosting the Tuesday edition of the show. Looking forward to getting into some of the Fantasy 101 stuff. We'll try to start that tomorrow, barring any other free agency decisions. We'll talk about everything right from the get-go. And we're not going to talk about like what the statistical categories actually mean. We're going to assume that you've got that. If you're degenerate enough to listen to a fantasy basketball podcast, I think you've got those basics. But just from, how do we figure out what guys can improve upon, how to study career arcs, how to prep for fantasy draft, what are we looking for? I love the looking for stuff. We do a lot of that during the regular season as well. There's just so many things to cover as to how we got to this point. I try not to repeat myself too much in this podcast, but I think it's time to go back and rebuild the foundation, even if it's just for a couple of days. Once again, this is Fantasy NBA Today, a hoopball presentation. I am Dan. Take it away, Donna.
This has been a Hoop Ball presentation.